Hi, and welcome back to Football Made Simple.
Derby weekend kicked off in North London with Arteta pitting his wits against Antonio Conte. Arteta's Arsenal came out on top with a confident 3-1 win thanks to goals by Partey, Jesus and Xhaka, whilst Kane scored for Spurs. The non-penalty XG shows that Arsenal were much more of a threat, but how were Arteta's tactics able to rip Spurs apart? And despite the loss, what headaches did Conte give Arteta? Let's take a look. And if you're into fantasy football, join me on Spitch, which is my favorite fantasy football app, and this is how my team looks this week. I like it because before the match, you can look in depth at a player's previous stats, and Spitch also cares about so much more than just goals and assists, letting you score points for passes, tackles and so much more, so midfield players like Kovacic can actually score points. On top of that, you can join at any time because prizes are given out weekly and your scores reset weekly. If that sounds good, download it through the link in the description and join my community, FMS FC. Now let's start with Arsenal on the ball. Even before the sending off, Spurs were not pressing particularly high, so Arsenal could come through the first phase relatively easily. And higher up the pitch, we know that Odegaard likes to move into the half space, while Xhaka then moves into the left half space. And at times during this season, we've seen Arsenal build up with more of a 3-2, with Zinchenko and Partey forming a double pivot whilst White stays deeper. However, Spurs' defensive shape was more of a 5-4-1, with Son and Richarlison both dropping much deeper, and as a result, Kane would be the sole forward who would be in a pressing position. So 3 centre-backs were not necessary, and instead, Arsenal shifted to more of a 2-3. And this shape would give Arsenal some potential advantages, as with Spurs only having a double pivot of Højbjerg and Betancourt, they could overload these midfield numbers, as Odegaard and Xhaka would also be options, creating something like a 5 versus 2. So Arsenal are high up the pitch here, but they maintain the same principles. 2 centre-backs deeper, a midfield 3 of Zinchenko, Partey and Ben White, whilst up top, the front 5 is Martinelli out to the left, although he often rotated with Jesus, Xhaka in the left half space, Jesus at centre forward, Odegaard's there, and off screen, Saka is there as well, creating a 2-3-5. Whilst you can see that at times, this would mean that Spurs' double pivots could be overloaded. So in order to reduce the effects of this overload central, Son and Richarlison had to defend extremely narrow, so that the Spurs shape would often look like this, as this would make it much more difficult to access the men in the half spaces, whilst there was also potential to press at times. Arsenal have the previously discussed numbers around the ball, and as a result, the Spurs midfield 4 are occupying a very narrow portion of the pitch in order to compensate. But defending so narrowly here creates obvious problems out wide for them, and Arsenal would immediately look to take advantage by looking to find their wingers in the wide regions, as they would often be in 1 versus 1 situations. And both Martinelli and Saka throughout the 90 were looking to take their opportunities to take on their wing-back 1 versus 1, and Martinelli in particular was often able to get around the outside and into dangerous positions. But it wasn't always a case of just directly finding the winger. Often they would push higher to keep the wing-backs deeper, and Xhaka in particular down the left-hand side would often look to find space down the outside. And with Zinchenko initially receiving and looking to keep Richarlison narrow, it would mean that Xhaka was often able to receive the ball outside, so that now there was a 2 versus 1, giving him space to look for a pass potentially. Or, if Richarlison and a midfielder then look to come across to cover, this would create more space higher up for the Arsenal midfielder to now move into and look to find a pass higher up, as now there are more gaps in the midfield. So, as we've just seen, Spurs are defending fairly narrowly, and Zinchenko is on the left, and this creates space for Xhaka to potentially receive on the outside of him. Rather than immediately cover wide, Richarlison is instead drawn to Zinchenko of the ball, and then this creates the opportunity for him to find Xhaka in the space. So now you can see Xhaka would have potentially much more room than usual to drive into if he chose to do so, or a man could find room there as well. But also interestingly, where at the beginning of the move it looked like this, with Partey essentially impossible to access in this region, once the ball does come to Xhaka and we see Richarlison as well as Betancourt looking to cover, now Partey is in the space to receive the ball. And Partey can then help create the switch to Saka to be 1 versus 1 with Perisic. And much like Martinelli, Saka did find himself 1 versus 1 with Perisic often. Although the difference was, as we know, Son is an extremely hard worker, so he would often come wider in order to create a 2 versus 1 against Saka. But this would naturally mean that the midfield would have to look to shift across, as there would potentially be 3 men around the ball supporting, often White and Odegaard, and this could then create space for the midfielders. And this is actually how Partey scores his goal. Initially we can see that Son is narrow, looking to cover White as we discussed, meaning that at first when he receives, Saka is 1 versus 1. But Son is quick to recover. And in the first half in particular, White is always in this position in order to be an easy pass-back option for Saka when necessary. You can also see in the centre that Højbjerg has been drawn towards Odegaard, who's making the move into the box, and Betancourt is drawn to Martinelli, who's rotated with Xhaka. So this now means there's a little bit of extra space for Partey to attempt the shot, although this was just a great strike. And despite being the better of the two teams in the first half, Arteta remained adaptable. Where before, whenever Saka received for the 1 versus 1, and Perisic and Son were quick to create the 2 versus 1, would see Ben White be the support option in a deeper position. But in the second half he was highly aggressive, looking to overlap down the outside, so that this was a 2 versus 2, and often this would draw Perisic and would allow Saka to be 1 versus 1 with Son, or vice versa, which of course is much more dangerous than being 2 versus 1 down. And this leads to Arsenal's second goal. So as we've seen, Son is initially narrow, creating the opportunity for Saka to receive, and Ben White is initially deep. Saka receives for his 1 versus 1, and Son is already beginning to come across. But now the difference is the movement of Ben White, who's willing to overlap around the outside. This creates momentary hesitation in Perisic, allowing Saka to cut in and have the shot, which is then dealt with awfully, and being so good in the wide regions would often also create opportunities centrally. This midfield 3 would often draw the Spurs midfield, as when they advanced higher they couldn't always sit off, and as a result there was more space between the lines. And the likes of Martinelli, Xhaka, Jesus, Odegaard and Saka, who was also drifting across, would often be able to find temporary space between the lines to receive. This would often happen in Arsenal's left half space, because Zinchenko would often be on the ball drawing Betancourt and then creating more space in this region. So Zinchenko is on the ball, and this draws Betancourt towards him, opening up a little bit of space in this region. Zinchenko goes wide to Xhaka, who as we discussed is often on the outside of the block, and Betancourt comes across a little bit to make sure that Xhaka isn't in space. This then creates room for Jesus to receive between the lines from Zinchenko, and he can turn and look to move forward. And here's a similar scenario, with Zinchenko drawing Betancourt out of position. Now it's both Saka and Jesus in space between the lines. Jesus receives, and Romero moves to press him, creating space in this region. Jesus is fouled, but you could see the potential for a 1-2 if he hadn't been. Arteta's Arsenal are going to be a serious problem this season, and Arsenal fans should be excited. But despite the good performance, Spurs also look dangerous before the sending off, as we'll cover in our next video, so hit subscribe so that you don't miss that. But for the tactical score, Arteta gets a 9 with near flawless execution, whilst Conte failed to adapt at times, even before the sending off, giving him a 5. But what are your thoughts? Drop them down below.
I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, you might enjoy the content available on my Patreon. Not only does Patreon help to support the continued production of content, as I am a one-man team, but it also gives you early access to videos that will come on the channel. You'll also get exclusive videos, get to vote on polls, and so much more. And it's cheaper than ever, no longer having a tier system, so everyone on the Patreon gets access to all the content. So head over to patreon.com/footballmadesimple to check it out.